At some point during this 21st century, will Britain do something it's avoided since the 17th and descend into civil war? The question of whether our country, this rich, seemingly civilised nation of ours, could succumb to bloody internal conflict is one I hesitate to put. In many parts of Britain, it is the rhetorical equivalent of breaking wind in polite company, a taboo which, if broken, puts you in the company of madmen, or at least of preppers, survivalists who are forever preparing for the end of the world, hoarding dried foods, digging bunkers in their basement, telling anyone who will listen that they should buy a wind-up radio. But that taboo is fading. I remember exactly where I was not so very long ago when an old friend, he studied history at university, told me that he felt Britain, Mother of Parliament's Britain, unarmed police officers' Britain, queuing and Wimbledon and cream teas Britain was bound ineluctably for civil war. Even 2 years ago, to say so was still to risk being called a crank and much worse. In 2024, in the wake of the Southport attacks and subsequent riots, Elon Musk said civil war in Britain was inevitable, his word. His intervention was condemned by politicians who accused him of fomenting unrest from afar, but by this year, the idea was moving, if not exactly into the mainstream, then into that part of the Overton window inhabited by some thoughtful people with considered opinions. In February, the podcaster Louise Perry did an interview with David Betz, a professor at King's College London, which went viral. Professor Betz said mass migration, ethnic strife, and an out-of-touch elite meant that civil conflict was coming to the West, and that it might happen first in Britain, if not Britain, then France. Next week is the 25th anniversary of the ethnic riots in Bradford, my hometown, in which 300 police officers were injured. It was the worst ever unrest in this country involving British-born Asians, more accurately, Asians of Pakistani heritage. But Professor Betz wasn't talking about one-off spasms of violence like the one which began in Bradford on July the 7th, 2001, and which, though it had to be suppressed with the introduction of no fewer than 1,000 riot police officers, was over in a couple of days. No, Professor Betz meant something more like an intifada, a rolling civil conflict in which tens of thousands could be killed each year for years, in which cities would become ungovernable, his words, and seen by an indigenous rural population as lost to foreign occupation. To discuss such things, as Boris Johnson's former right-hand man Dominic Cummings pointed out in an interview he gave to Sky News, is no longer abnormal. As if to prove the point, the latest leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, said in a BBC interview broadcast just last month, in an admission which deserved much more attention than it got, that civil war in Britain was no longer unthinkable. These people disagree on the numbers, on the timing and the likelihood of it happening, but not on the principle of the possibility. Badenoch said no more than it was a danger in the long run. Elon Musk says it's unavoidable, even in the short term. David Betz says, with a precision we'd expect from a professor, that the chances of civil war starting by 2029 are about 1 in 5. But on the broad principle that civil war is no longer the dark fantasy of online deviants, that it is a real possibility that we must plan for, or at least plan to avoid, they all agree. Like the advance of AI, it is becoming a dark, apocalyptic cloud on the horizon. And this year, whether it was the disturbances in Southampton in the wake of the Henry Novak trial, or the riots in Belfast in which migrants were burned out of their homes, we perhaps begin to see not simply one-off acts of disconnected violence, but early instalments in a joined-up story that leads us to a bigger, bloodier picture of national strife. As usual, the public is far ahead of the politicians when it comes to the subjects that really matter. You will not find this topic tabled for debate in our increasingly prissy parliament, but it's there, in the wisdom of crowds, in homes and on Facebook, around barbecues, over holiday drinks. Talk is turning to what a future dystopia might mean. Civil war is not an abstract idea. It is, I would argue, featuring right now, today, In some conversations, ordinary folk are having about tomorrow's Britain, about where they will live, city or suburb, urban or rural, about which country their children should think of moving to and settling in, not just where they can make a living, but where they and their children will be safe as well as prosperous. Whether it's white flight to the countryside or immigration to Australia or wherever, a long-term view of the future is being taken in some quarters, which, when push comes to shove, is informed by some seriously dark forebodings. This was really brought home to me early this year when I was working in Westminster with groups of Reform UK members who hoped to become councillors or even MPs. At one end of a session, with one especially sparky, articulate, ethnically mixed clutch of candidates, I asked them what it was that had made them put their shoulders to the reform wheel. What had made them go door-to-door canvassing, in some instances, face personal abuse, lose friends, fall out with family? To a man and woman, they all agreed it was because if they did nothing, evil would prevail and the country would tear itself apart. In the one big bit of British polling that's been done about this, no fewer than 6 in 10 Reform voters think civil war within the next decade is either very likely or somewhat likely. And lest you think that makes them statistical freaks, consider that the same poll found that a third of all voters, 1/3, share that view. Such talk will sound hysterical to many and utterly without foundation, but to them I say, unstop your ears and listen. The world around you is changing, and although it's not always obvious if all you see is the Guardian, the kinder parts of North London or blue sky, ours is a small island, and the future, if it is to be a future of civil unrest, will spare no one. So what would it look like, this civil war? Who sparks it? What sustains it? Where and how does it end? Why should Britain be, as David Betz suggests, more vulnerable to its siren call than many other countries? Let me start with that last point. We like to think of ourselves, we British, as civilised. We enjoy obeying and creating rules. As you sit back and watch the World Cup this week, consider that the world's biggest sporting event is played to a football rule book that was drafted and codified here in Britain. We like to think that by chopping off our king's head in 1649, we managed to wash the impulsive insurrection right out of our hair. Civil unrest was something that happened somewhere else. In basket case countries in Latin America or Indochina, countries infected by the French vice of revolution or the Russian creed of communism. We were, or so we like to think, a model of Anglo-Saxon stability and orderliness and toleration. But let me ask you a question. What would it take for this country to break? When it comes to withstanding genuine turmoil and privation, how big is its bank of civic togetherness? Even in an era when trust ran supposedly high in Britain, the reality of social cohesion has rarely lived up to expectations. Take London in 1940, when Luftwaffe bombs rained down night after night. We choose to remember it as a time of coming together in adversity. We even gave it a name, the Blitz spirit. But in truth, something different was happening. Crime spiked. The blackouts and empty homes created perfect conditions. The burglars, they cashed in. Sorry if that sounds a little bit Hobbesian, but when people have their backs to the wall, even a British wall, they can often be, as Thomas Hobbes knew, nasty and brutish. Nowhere was this more true than in the former Yugoslavia. I only went there once as a reporter, but the stories of how quickly neighbour turned on neighbour when things fell apart stay with me still. Conversely, I've seen social cohesion at its best, and it wasn't in Britain. It was in Japan in 2011, where I was sent to report on the awful earthquake which claimed the lives of some 19,000 Japanese. The quake produced a gigantic tsunami, the after effects of which seemed to bring to life a disaster movie. One evening, for instance, the camera crew and I were driving around the bend of a coastal road only to find it blocked by a fishing trawler washed ashore. But there is another memory in its own way just as odd, which stays with me still. In the days after the tidal wave hit, 500,000 people were made homeless. Many of them were trying to reach safety, filling their cars with a few belongings and heading to stay with friends or family away from the areas affected by the earthquake, the tidal waves, and the subsequent Fukushima nuclear power station leak. In some places, it felt like the whole country was on the move. But even though fuel was in vanishingly short supply and motorists were queuing for hours to fill up their tanks, nowhere did I see order break down. Quite the opposite. Everywhere, long, disciplined lines of cars waiting patiently in turn in the heat. I kept thinking, imagine if this were England. Time was when, as a nation, we shared Japan's international reputation for orderly politeness, a sense of fair play, and a deep attachment to the queue as the best mechanism for accessing scarce resources. But those days are increasingly in the rear view window. Japan may have retained high levels of social trust, but ours are in free fall. Try to imagine drivers in some English cities waiting in line for fuel. After a few hours, I predict that the thin patina of civilizational solidarity would wear very thin very quickly. Why the difference? The obvious answer is the one those on the left find least palatable. Japan has retained high levels of social cohesion because it has resisted high levels of immigration. Japanese interpersonal norms have not been diluted by the arrival of millions of foreigners who do not share those rigid social conventions. Nobody films machete fights on the streets of Tokyo because the machetes never arrived. 20 years ago, I wrote a book for a think tank about birth rates. I was struck then by how countries like Japan were suffering sclerotic economic growth because they refused, as we didn't, to import cheap workers from abroad to give their finances an artificial boost. But the flip side of that stagnation is a society less fractured. Japan has not, as we have in London, witnessed suicide bombings and the beheading of a serving soldier on the streets of its capital. It has not seen parts of its biggest cities, like Bradford and Birmingham, become places where the natives no longer feel welcome. Japan's Prime Minister, like our own Kemi Badenoch, a woman and a conservative, is not acknowledging that her country might one day face civil war. What then might a civil war in Britain look like? According to Professor David Betz, it wouldn't be pitched battles like those of Marston Moor or Gettysburg or the Bastille. There would be no huge conflagration, no Waterloo or D-Day or Road to Baghdad. Rather, there would be something more like a slow, attritional drip, drip, drip of bloodletting. Never a hot war, but a cold, uneasy peace, sporadically flaring up into something worse. In the 1990s, when I was based in Jerusalem for a few months, I met one of the most impressive statesmen I've ever met, Shimon Peres, the one-time Israeli Prime Minister. History credits him with making sure his country developed a nuclear deterrent, but he was also the man who coined the word Lebanonization. He was referring to what had happened to Israel's northern neighbour, Lebanon, which over a few decades went from being a French Riviera on the Levant to a fragmented mosaic of militias, competing clans and confessional blocs, where Shia and Sunni Muslims, Christians and Druze and Alawites occasionally battled it out, formed temporary alliances and generally watched one another warily from their own battered enclaves. Lebanon is still just about one country. No sectarian group is big enough to secede and carve out an independent state, even if they wanted to. But its delicate ethnic and sectarian balance was shattered forever by waves of Palestinian immigration from the 1970s onwards, and it's never recovered. If the far end of the Mediterranean feels too distant, then there's always what happened also starting in the 1970s just across the Irish Sea. The troubles of Northern Ireland might be a better template for what might one day come to be normal on parts of the British mainland. I think that might be why the recent alleged attack by a migrant on a local man in Belfast got the reaction it did, not just in Ulster, where paramilitary activity was rekindled, homes and cars burned, but in mainland Britain, where many suburbs now fly flags as if to mark out territory in a way which has unignorable parallels with those sectarian dividing lines in Belfast. Ultimately, though, I'm not sure how useful recent history is when it comes to assessing whether Britain's future really is to become a failed state or a series of states within a state. To some degree, we might be succumbing to an American obsession. Parts of the US seem sufficiently certain that they will soon be fighting another civil war, that Hollywood has already turned the idea into a movie? Are we embracing a dystopian vision because, like the culture wars themselves, we import so many of our quarrels from America? Well, it's certainly true that a second American Civil War in a country where gun ownership remains legal feels more likely, imminent even, than in a country like ours where the state has a near monopoly on weaponry. But that's not to say it's an impossibility. Again, as David Betz suggests, the sort of future we face is one in which British cities, become places where the writ of the state no longer runs because insurrectionists use guerrilla tactics to cripple essential infrastructure or carry out targeted assassinations, perhaps with nothing more sophisticated than a petrol bomb, a knife, or a car. When it comes to working out whether a state of civil war is Britain's destiny, history and geography can actually only tell us so much. Demography may be the key, in particular the unprecedented demographic asymmetry of our time, when whole cohorts of people from some communities have decided to limit the size of their family to 1 or 0, while others, aided by technology which has made child mortality almost a thing of the past, seem undeterred by the contraceptive effects of things like the housing market. In Northern Ireland, one of the reasons the Protestant community felt beleaguered, but also destined to be marginalised, was because they could see that their Catholic neighbours would one day outnumber them at the ballot box by dint of having more babies. Of course, the Troubles came to an end. There was a peace deal. Most of the men of violence put down their guns. And whether it was Northern Ireland or Bosnia or the end of apartheid in South Africa, we like to think that the arc of history tends towards reconciliation, not bombing the hell out of each other. This is the same arc of history which insisted that the end of the Cold War meant victory forever and always for Western democracy. It's not turned out that way, as events in Ukraine remind us. So if it were to be civil war, what could be the underlying causes that could take a spark and sustain an inferno? And just as critically, who would the combatants be? David Betz and other academics who have made a study of the history of warfare do recognise some patterns. One is that revolutions and civil unrest are often the product of young, unemployed or underemployed or underpaid people whose idle hands the devil finds work to do. In the jargon, this is sometimes called elite overproduction, too many clever, energetic young folk chasing too few opportunities. It was how the Arab Spring, you remember the Arab Spring, that series of revolutions which gripped countries like Egypt and Tunisia in 2011, came about. The Arc of History crowd at one point suggested North Africa, thanks to all those angry young men, would become as democratic as North America. Didn't end that way. Certainly not for Colonel Gaddafi, who I interviewed in Libya not long before he met a particularly nasty end in a construction tunnel as his country turned not towards free elections and feminism, but civil war and Islamism. But that idea that young, frustrated people are revolutionaries in waiting has many supporters. Today, here in Britain, people who describe themselves without a hint of self-doubt as literal communists, even though communism claimed, 100 million lives in the last century, often in civil wars. This new breed says Britain is rigged against them, and they do have the ghost of a point, the stupid expansion of higher education, which saddled young people with debts that stopped them owning homes and starting families. But rather than blaming Tony Blair for giving them expectations the state couldn't meet, and importing millions of migrants who would compete for jobs and houses and public services, they blame the system. To blame newcomers is to side with the forces of far-right hate. Better, easier, to hate business and private schools and farmers and all the rest instead. The other group Professor Betz identifies as potential foot soldiers in civil wars, if and when they happen, are people who feel dislodged and replaced and supplanted. Not young and angry, but often older and angry. I'm almost certainly one of them myself. And while there's nothing all that new in the idea of young revolutionaries, there is, I think, something quite novel about the mature citizens who join Unite the Kingdom marches, shin up lampposts to raise a cross of St. George, or indeed join Reform because they think the country faces a future of civil war. What's new, really new, about these older revolutionaries? I think it's their complete loss of trust in the institutions which they thought served them, and which they, or rather their ancestors, built over the course of many centuries. That's new. For an instinctive conservative like me, this has been one of the more shocking features of this country's political evolution over the last couple of years or so. Discovering that people whose diagnosis of the woes of the nation I often share no longer believe in the monarchy, too woke, not my king, the army, too woke, wouldn't fight for it, the police and judiciary, too woke, too two-tier. This has come to this man of the right as a jolt. I still believe it's possible to reverse what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called the slow march through the institutions, make the church less interested in paying reparations for slavery and keener on muscular Christianity, to give but one example. But the reality is that many on my side of the aisle have given up on the idea of reformation or restoration or recovery. They're so pissed off, they just, like the Joker, want to see the whole thing burn. Where does this take us? With activism increasing on the left, but also now appealing to the right-wing white working class that hitherto didn't much feel the need for such things, whether it's raising the colours or dismantling cameras on the edge of London as a protest against Sadiq Khan's ULEZ tax, the right is, to borrow a left-wing word, mobilising. And then there's a third group, not left, not right, and certainly not somewhere in between. The Islamists, who have shown in the last couple of years that they feel much more in common with their co-religionists far away in the Middle East than they do with their fellow British citizens just down the road. The Islamists who, when you can get them to answer opinion poll questions honestly, do not hold views about women or gays or Jews or suicide bombers or blasphemy which belong to anything resembling a British tradition of toleration. I mentioned earlier that next week is the 25th anniversary of the riot in Bradford, which by some miracle did not lead to any deaths, but which, had it happened in London, would have generated much more comment than it did. A couple of months after the Bradford riot, 9/11 happened. In the years of terror and turmoil that followed, months all told, I spent in Iraq and Afghanistan and southern Lebanon, and I thought hard there about what the war on terror meant for Britain, meant for Bradford. After 7/7, an Islamist attack which saw 52 Britons murdered by suicide bombers, 3 of whom came from just a short drive away from Bradford, I found myself saying to people that I expected my home city to resemble Belfast during the Troubles by the 2020s. That has not happened. Does it mean I'm wrong? I really hope I am. Or does it mean that Islamists have realised that they can get what they want by the patient application of democracy and demography rather than the messy business of terrorism and conflict with all the dangers it carries that the other side might just start fighting back? I don't know, but I do know it's wrong to label talk of civil war as irresponsible or insightful. For many of us, it's a prudent response to a country changing so fast it can barely catch its breath. It's why when Nigel Farage talks about small boats crossing the English Channel, he notes that they do so carrying men of fighting age. What does he mean by that, men of fighting age? Half the country pretends not to notice, or makes a show of being appalled. The other half, which includes people like me, looks at the pictures of the men on the boats of fighting age and wonders, will I live long enough to see whether this ends like I expect it to? Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.